Welcome back, Honors. All right, so I know the last couple days been kind of crazy because we've been moving at light speed and we've been reviewing a lot and we've been getting real into it and blah, 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 blah. But like, this is a very important unit for y'all to learn on a very, very large scale, and for y'all to have to look at maps and draw things and know things and understand them and blah, 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 right? So the biggest thing about it that we're getting into now is we're going to be talking about like the lasting effects of like this global economy. We talked about a couple of them in particular, right? We talked about like initial contact is going to cause this thing called the Columbian Exchange, which is going to cause increased life expectancy, which is going to cause also the spread of disease, which is also going to cause like blah, 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 like all these other different things. And where we left off in class, we were talking about like this hub of the global economy. We talked about how it's not just this simple. We talked about how there are goods coming from Asia all the way back to Europe. There are goods coming around like this region all the way back to Europe. Not so much here or here, but we talked about that. We talked about how there was just some silver going to China and stuff like that. We talked about how there's a major difference between money being gained and exploitation of already like somewhat what you call civilized people, right? So we talked about that, and now we got to get into like the positives and negatives of this era of global contact, and we also have to get into one very all-important thing, this leg right here. The transportation of slaves to the Americas, right? Because we talked yesterday's flip about the encomienda system and how that's going to see the execution of a lot of, well, not the execution, but the dying off and the death of a lot of natives due to disease and overworking and malnutrition and stuff like that. Like, why is my hair doing all this stuff? Now, anyway, but let's go ahead and get into it, all right? So, anyway, positives and negatives of, don't write triangle trade, write the global economy, right? Big positive for the Europeans anyway is a lot of money is going to be made. Now, ironically enough, for some like Indian Rajas, a lot of money is going to be made. For a lot of like some of the Southeast Asian countries, for the already wealthy, a lot of money is going to be made. And then you have the biggest one, cultural diffusion, right? And then you have international relations are going to be promoted, and we're going to help establish new countries. We're going to do all this amazing stuff, right? Now, giant negatives though. And when I say like international relations, we're talking about like communication between different cultural groups, and we're also talking about establishing new countries. Like the United States of America would not be here today without this global economy. The countries of South America, Brazil would not be there without this whole deal. Now, negatives though, ships could be lost at sea, people could die. It increased the dependency on slavery, and it also promoted racism. All right, so now, and not just racism from the African to European perspective, but racism from European to Native, European to African, European to Indian, or vice versa. All these different kinds of like negative ideas from all sides, right? From people viewing Europeans negatively and Europeans viewing them negatively, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera, right? This is something that we know is factually true, right? It is going to promote a lot of these negatives. Now, continuing forward though, we are going to now take a chance to also talk about how industries and cities are going to start to thrive. Trade is going to help cities grow, right? You're going to see a lot of major ones, like, for example, New York, right, which was formerly known as New Amsterdam, all right? So, or all these other, like, major areas are going to grow, these coastal areas. New Orleans is going to be a city that grows wildly because of all these, like, different trade dynamics between this global economy, right? The slave trade, though, is especially going to help cities in North America grow fast and make a lot of money. Now, North America and South America, right? And South America. You'll see why you got to include South America on that, like, that word here in a little bit. But without the slave trade, the U.S. may have never grown to how powerful it is today. But remember, that is at the expense of lives lost and people being forever, like, destroyed, communities being gone, culture being wrecked, and, like, so we are all thankful to live in a country this powerful and this bountiful and this plentiful. Unfortunately, though, it was at the expense of something absolutely terrible, and that was the transatlantic slave trade, right? The second leg of the transatlantic slave trade. The idea of Africans being transported to the Americas for the purpose of slavery, right? Also to Europe as well. They were also brought to Europe as well. They were also moved quite often, like all over, right? So we do need to talk about like this whole process in a sense, right? Now, so first of all, let's talk about like the trek to the ships, right? So now this whole slide is very important. I'm going to be saying a lot of extra stuff, right? Now, most Africans were taken from inland villages, all right? Now, I don't mean necessarily places all the way on the inside of Africa, like where you would call the Congo now, which is going to come up later, but that's in the late 1800s when the Europeans start to scramble for Africa. Thanks, quinine medicine. Now, we won't get into that right now, though, okay? But most Africans were taken from, like, shortly inland villages, right? Villages that were, like, about maybe at most 1,000 miles in off the shore. Now, really, really quickly, they would be marched or brought to coastal ports. Now, here's something really important you do need to jot down, you do need to write, and it is not the idea of relieving blame or being whatever. Remember when we talked about today in class, when we talked about goods coming from Europe to Africa? Iron, textiles, alcohol, guns, luxury items that Africans had never seen before because they were undeveloped societies, right? Those things are high market value. Now, the Europeans only want a couple things from Africa. They want precious minerals that they can find, gold, diamonds possibly. They want ivory, which was a big export at the time. The biggest thing the Africans had to trade with the Europeans, though, were other Africans, okay? Places like Ghana and the Ivory Coast grew to specialize in the trade of African slaves, right, at these coastal port cities, okay? The Europeans would show up on their boats, and Africans would trade other Africans for these goods, right? So, like, they would, for example, like in primitive African culture, all right? Not primitive, that's an aggressive word. I don't want to say that. In African culture during the late 1500s going into the 1600s, tribal warfare would usually result in the losing tribe being enslaved by the winning one, right? So when this triangular trade global market starts to blow up, a lot of these Africans start realizing they have the ability to now take these slaves that they gained from small wars and trade them to Europeans for goods like guns, cloth, cash, textiles, iron, things like that, right? So men, women, children are going to be bound together and marched as far as 1,000 miles in some cases, right, to get to these port cities to be traded, okay? Now, in this process, that is the same as if you were to walk from, like, Archbishop Chappelle High School to Washington, D.C., all right? So, like, that would take upwards of 20 days of straight walking, right? Now, around 90% of all slaves were taken or picked up on the west coast of Africa, right? So, usually the west coast. Now, in countries like Ghana and the Ivory Coast, which is what I mentioned a second ago. Slaves were then loaded onto large slave transportation vessels, right? Usually sometimes in the neighborhood of 500 people per ship, okay? Now, on average, only about 60% of them survived the trip due to the fact that the journey to the Americas could last anywhere from 3 weeks up to 3 months, all right? So ships are also going to face a lot of risks. They're going to face risks like storms. They're going to face risks like piracy is not as much of a risk. Actually, pirates were more often to liberate slaves on ships than they were to actually hurt them. But very often you could actually see like wars between feuding countries, the attempted smuggling or taking of certain items by feuding countries, things like that. But the ships are going to face a lot of risk. And if it hits a storm and the sailors get off on lifeboats, the slaves would be left on the vessel to drown, right? Sometimes if one slave was chained together in several links with several other slaves, if one of them got sick, sometimes the entire chain would just be thrown into the ocean to prevent the rest of the slaves from getting sick. But you're sacrificing like one sick person and then 5 healthy people, right? So you're talking about very vicious conditions. And they were never allowed to move. They were never allowed to see the top deck, right? So you're talking about disgusting conditions of sewage and disease running rampant. Some women apparently had to give birth under these decks in these conditions. There are a lot of terrible, terrible things going on. And this right here is the schematic of a storage for a slave vessel of about 292 slaves, 130 of them being slaved under the shelves as shown in figure 3 and 4. So this right here is a slave vessel. Usually the people were chained together, forced to lay down, right, and not actually allowed to move. There actually is, if you want to look this up, one case of a slave vessel actually liberating itself and taking over the boat away from Portuguese sailors. It's called the Amistad, all right, so Amistad, and they actually killed all the Portuguese sailors on top except for 2, but then still ended up in North America because they couldn't navigate the boat, they couldn't captain the boat, and then they actually got sued by the American government for like murder and crimes against people and the Portuguese government, and they actually won the entire court case. It's crazy. There's a really good movie on it too. But Matthew McConaughey's in it, or Anthony Hopkins. But yeah, like it's a very, very intense thing, and it's not something to be taken lightly, right? Like it's a very, very, very awful experience for these people. And around half of the slaves, give or take, about 60%, are going to live, but like 40% ish are going to die from disease, starvation, gross mistreatment, right? So some Africans would actually kill themselves or their children just to avoid being enslaved, right? So like this middle passage, this second leg of that hub is very, very, very awful, right? Now this pie chart shows slaves were distributed through the New World between 1500 and 1870. Also, as you can see, something that you do need to know, the distribution of slave imports during these years, the percentages of these percentages are as an infographic of where they all went. More than like the largest chunk went to Brazil, right? And Brazil was actually the last country on this hemisphere to outlaw slavery. They didn't outlaw slavery until 1888. Now only about 6% went to what is now the United States. Dutch, Danish, Swedish, Caribbean, about 6%. French Caribbean, British Caribbean, Spanish America. All of this mostly is for sugarcane plantations to replace the natives that had died from the encomienda system, right? Now, the impact of the slave trade on basically on the American cities as well as African culture. Many African cities and villages and societies are going to be destroyed while colonies in America are going to grow. About 2,000 slaves were sent to the Americas every year in the 1500s, so the late 1500s. By the 1700s, that number had grown to 80,000 per year, mainly for the introduction of cotton farming and also large-based sugarcane plantations. Now, by the 1800s, 11 million slaves had reached the Americas. 2 million of them had died because of the slave trade, which is absolutely ridiculous. And it is something you have to talk about. This is like talking about the Holocaust. You have to be ready to like actually understand these things and know that they have a huge impact on our society and is also on Western civilization in total. Okay, but that's going to be it. We're going to stop there tonight, and then tomorrow we're going to get into the scientific revolution. All right, so talk to you guys then. Y'all have a good one.